After my fall left me paralyzed from the waist down, my husband Norman abandoned me within 3 weeks, moved in with his secretary, and told everyone I'd never walk again. What he didn't know was that I was secretly recovering in physical therapy, and when I finally stood up at his engagement party 6 months later, I had more than just my ability to walk back. I had evidence that my fall wasn't an accident at all. The first 8 years of my marriage to Norman Bell felt like living inside a perfectly crafted fairy tale. Every morning, I'd wake up in our beautiful colonial home in Maplewood Heights, sunlight streaming through the bay windows of our master bedroom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And find Norman already awake, his arm wrapped protectively around me, as he scrolled through his phone, planning our day. "Good morning, beautiful," he'd whisper against my ear, his voice still husky with sleep. Those 3 words never failed to make my heart flutter, even after all those years together. Norman had this way about him, charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and surprised you with flowers on random Tuesdays just because he passed a florist and thought of you. We'd met during my final year at Georgetown University, where I was studying interior design and he was finishing his MBA. Norman was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: ambitious, well-dressed, from a good family, with plans that stretched far beyond college. He courted me the old-fashioned way: dinner dates at nice restaurants, weekend trips to his family's cabin in the mountains, long walks through the city, where he'd point out buildings and tell me about the businesses he planned to own someday. "Someday, Scarlett," he'd say, squeezing my hand, as we stood outside a gleaming office building downtown, "I'm going to have the corner office on the top floor, and you're going to design the most beautiful home for us to come back to every night." His confidence was magnetic. When Norman talked about the future, it felt inevitable, like we were already living in the success story he was writing for us. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of: a spring ceremony at the country club, where Norman's family had been members for 3 generations. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace and a dress I'd designed myself, flowing ivory silk that made me feel like a princess. Norman looked devastatingly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, and when he lifted my veil to kiss me at the altar, I genuinely believed I was the luckiest woman alive. The early years of our marriage were a whirlwind of shared dreams coming true. Norman landed a position at Maxton and Associates, a prestigious consulting firm, and his salary allowed us to buy our dream home, a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and enough space for the children we planned to have. I started my own interior design business, Scarlett Stanley Designs, working out of the converted sunroom that Norman had surprised me with for our 2nd anniversary. "This is just the beginning, sweetheart," he'd said, as he unveiled the space, complete with a drafting table, fabric samples, and a brand new computer system. "I want you to have everything you need to build your empire." He was so supportive in those days, so proud when I landed my first major client, so encouraging when I worked late into the night, perfecting design proposals. We fell into beautiful routines together. Sunday mornings meant sleeping late, and then cooking elaborate brunches while jazz music played throughout the house. Norman would read me interesting articles from the business section of the newspaper, while I sketched new design ideas, my feet tucked under his legs on our leather sofa. Tuesday evenings were our date nights, sometimes dinner at a new restaurant I'd discovered, sometimes a movie, sometimes just driving around looking at houses and imagining how we'd redecorate them. Norman was thoughtful in ways that made me feel treasured. He remembered that I liked my coffee with exactly 1 sugar cube and a splash of real cream. He'd leave little notes in my design portfolio when he knew I had important client meetings. "Knock them dead beautiful. You're the most talented designer in the city." When I had a stressful week, he'd draw me a bath with lavender oil and light candles throughout our bathroom, then bring me a glass of wine and sit on the edge of the tub, asking about my day and listening like every detail mattered. Our social life was everything I'd imagined it would be. Norman's colleagues adored me, and their wives welcomed me into their circle with genuine warmth. We hosted dinner parties that became legendary among our friends. I'd design beautiful tablescapes and menus, while Norman charmed everyone with his wit and business stories. We were the couple others looked up to, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. You two are relationship goals, our friend Virginia Prince told me at one of our garden parties, watching Norman refill everyone's drinks and tell animated stories about his latest business trip. Norman worships the ground you walk on, Scarlett. You can see it in the way he looks at you, and I could see it too. Norman's eyes would find mine across crowded rooms, and he'd wink or mouth "I love you" when he thought no one was watching. He introduced me to everyone as my brilliant wife, the designer, and his pride was genuine. When I won my first design award from the Metropolitan Home Association, Norman was in the front row of the ceremony, cheering louder than anyone else. Our home became a reflection of our happiness, every room carefully designed to be both beautiful and comfortable, filled with pieces that told the story of our relationship. The antique dining table we'd found at a flea market during our honeymoon in Vermont, the custom bookshelves Norman had built for my ever-growing collection of design magazines and art books, the gallery wall of photographs documenting our adventures, hiking in Colorado, wine tasting in Napa, Christmas mornings with both our families. We talked constantly about children, about the family we'd build in this perfect house. Norman had already picked out which room would be the nursery, and I'd secretly started a Pinterest board of design ideas for a baby's room. We agreed we wanted 2 children, maybe 3, and we'd joke about whether they'd inherit Norman's business sense or my creative eye. Probably both, Norman would say, pulling me close on the sofa, after another evening of baby name brainstorming. They're going to be unstoppable, just like their mother. Life felt limitless in those days. Every success Norman achieved at work meant more opportunities for both of us. Every new client I landed brought us closer to the financial freedom that would let us start our family. We were building something beautiful together, something that felt unshakable. Looking back now, I realize that those 8 years weren't just the happiest of my life, they were the foundation that made everything that happened later so much more devastating. Because when someone loves you that completely, when they make you feel that safe and cherished, you never imagine they're capable of destroying you entirely. But I was about to learn just how wrong I could be about the man I thought I knew better than anyone. The changes started so subtly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It began around our 7th year of marriage, when Norman received his promotion to senior partner at Maxton and Associates. I was so proud of him. We celebrated with champagne and dinner at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where he'd proposed. But something shifted after that night, something I couldn't quite put my finger at first. Norman started working later, much later, where he used to be home by 7 for our dinners together. Suddenly he was walking through the door at 9, 10, sometimes even 11 o'clock. His explanations were always reasonable. Important clients needed attention, deals had to be closed, the senior partners expected more from him now. I understood, or at least I tried to. Success required sacrifice, and I had my own demanding clients to manage. But it wasn't just the hours, it was the way he'd come home and immediately disappear into his home office, claiming he had emails to catch up on, or presentations to review. The man who used to seek me out the moment he walked through the door, who'd wrap his arms around me in the kitchen and ask about my day, now barely acknowledged my presence. When I'd knock on his office door with a cup of coffee, or just to say goodnight, he'd look up from his computer with mild irritation, as if I were interrupting something important. "Not now, Scarlett," became his most common phrase. "I'm in the middle of something critical." Our Sunday morning routine was the first casualty. Norman started bringing work home on weekends, spreading papers across our dining room table, and treating our sacred lazy mornings like they were frivolous wastes of time. When I suggested we maintain at least our brunch tradition, he'd sigh heavily and check his phone, making it clear that spending time with me was just another obligation on his endless to-do list. "Can't you see I'm drowning here?" he snapped one Sunday, when I'd made his favorite French toast and set the table with our good china. "This promotion isn't just about a title, Scarlett. There are expectations, responsibilities you wouldn't understand." The dismissiveness in his voice stung more than the words themselves. Since when did Norman speak to me like I was incapable of understanding his work? I'd been his sounding board for years, listening to his strategies and celebrating his wins. Now he treated me like a child who couldn't grasp adult concepts. Our date nights disappeared entirely. When I'd suggest going to a new restaurant or seeing a movie, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Norman would look at me like I'd proposed something completely unreasonable. "I don't have time for that kind of thing anymore," he'd say, not even looking up from his laptop. "Maybe next month when this project is finished." But next month never came. There was always another project, another crisis, another reason why spending time with his wife wasn't a priority. The physical distance grew alongside the emotional withdrawal. Norman started staying up later in his office, coming to bed long after I'd fallen asleep. He'd slip under the covers quietly, careful not to wake me, but I was often lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and wondering where my husband had gone. The man who used to pull me close and whisper about his day now stayed on his side of the bed, as far from me as our king-size mattress would allow. Our conversations, when they happened at all, became purely functional. "Did you pay the electric bill? The Hendersons want to reschedule dinner. Your mother called." We sounded like roommates managing household logistics, not husband and wife sharing a life together. I started paying attention to the details that didn't add up. Norman claimed to be working constantly, but his dress shirts didn't smell like the office anymore. They carried unfamiliar perfume that definitely wasn't mine. He'd shower immediately when he came home, even on days when he claimed to have been stuck in conference rooms all evening. His phone, which used to sit openly on our kitchen counter, was now always face down and accompanied him everywhere, even to the bathroom. When I asked casual questions about his work, who he'd had lunch with, how the Anderson account was progressing, whether his new assistant was working out, Norman's answers became vague and defensive. He'd accuse me of checking up on him, of not trusting him, of being paranoid and clingy. "I work my ass off to provide for this family," he'd say, his voice rising with an anger that seemed disproportionate to my simple questions. "The least you could do is show some appreciation instead of interrogating me the moment I walk through the door." But I wasn't interrogating him. I was just trying to connect with my husband, to be part of his world the way I'd always been. His reaction told me more than any answer could have. The final straw came on our 8th wedding anniversary. I'd planned a romantic evening at home, candles, his favorite meal, a bottle of the wine we'd shared on our honeymoon. I'd even bought new lingerie and scattered rose petals on our bed, hoping to recapture some of the intimacy we'd lost. Norman walked in at 10:30, took one look at the elaborate setup, and barely suppressed his annoyance. "Really, Scarlett? Tonight? I told you I have the Morrison presentation tomorrow. I can't deal with this right now." He didn't even acknowledge that it was our anniversary until I reminded him, and then his apology felt obligatory, rehearsed. He ate dinner in silence, checking his phone between bites, and when I suggested we at least have a glass of wine together, he claimed he needed to stay sharp for his morning meeting. That night, lying alone in our bed surrounded by the rose petals that now felt pathetic instead of romantic, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to deny for months. My husband was having an affair, the signs were all there, had been there for weeks, but I'd been too afraid to see them clearly. Norman Bell, the man who'd promised to love and cherish me, who'd made me feel like the center of his universe, was sharing himself with someone else. And worse, he was treating me like an inconvenience in my own life, an obstacle to whatever new happiness he'd found. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether he was cheating. I was certain he was. The question was what I was going to do about it, and whether the man I'd fallen in love with still existed somewhere beneath this cold stranger who'd taken his place. I had no idea that discovering his affair would be the least of my problems, or that the real nightmare was only just beginning. The truth came crashing down on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, and it wasn't even Norman who revealed it. It was his carelessness, his overconfidence, his absolute certainty that I was too naive and trusting to piece together what was happening right under my nose. I'd finished early with a client meeting downtown and decided to surprise Norman with lunch at his office. We hadn't shared a meal together in weeks, and I thought maybe if I made the effort to enter his world, we could start rebuilding the connection we'd lost. I stopped at his favorite deli and picked up the turkey and Swiss sandwich he'd ordered every Friday for the past 3 years, along with the specific brand of sparkling water he preferred. The receptionist at Maxton and Associates, a sweet older woman named Mrs. Chen, greeted me warmly when I walked into the sleek downtown office building. "Oh, Scarlett, how lovely to see you. Are you here to surprise Norman?" "I thought I'd bring him lunch," I said, holding up the bag. "Is he in his office?" Something flickered across her face, a brief hesitation that I might have missed if I hadn't been so attuned to reading people's expressions after months of trying to decode Norman's moods. "Well, he's in a meeting right now, with his assistant. They've been working very closely on the Morrison account." The way she said "very closely" sent a chill down my spine. Mrs. Chen had been with the firm for 15 years. She wasn't one for gossip or implications. If she was choosing her words that carefully, there was a reason. "His assistant?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "I don't think I've met her yet." "Natalie Maxton," Mrs. Chen said, and I caught the slight emphasis on the last name. She's been very dedicated to helping Norman with his projects." Maxton, as in Maxton and Associates. Norman's assistant wasn't just any employee, she was family, connected to the firm's founding partners. That explained so much about Norman's sudden dedication to work, his long hours, his defensive attitude about office questions. "I see," I managed. "Well, maybe I'll just leave this for him." And actually, Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. They went out for a working lunch. To discuss strategy, she paused, then added quietly. "They do that quite often these days." The sandwich felt heavy in my hands. Working lunches, strategy sessions, long hours with the boss's daughter, who was conveniently positioned as his assistant. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. I thanked Mrs. Chen and left the building, but instead of going home, I found myself walking aimlessly through downtown, my mind racing. I ended up at a coffee shop across the street from Norman's building, ordering tea I didn't want, and positioning myself at a window table where I could see the entrance. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was creating drama where none existed, but I couldn't leave. Something compelled me to stay, to witness whatever truth was waiting to reveal itself. At 2:15 I saw them. Norman and a stunning brunette in her late 20s, walking toward the building entrance with the easy familiarity of people who spent significant time together. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand briefly touching his arm, but it wasn't just the casual contact that made my blood run cold, it was the way Norman looked at her. I recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd worn when he looked at me during our early years together, the one that said this person was the center of his universe. Adoration mixed with possession, tenderness combined with desire. He was looking at Natalie Maxton the way he used to look at me, the way he hadn't looked at me in over a year. They paused outside the building entrance, and Norman glanced around, a guilty, furtive movement that confirmed everything I suspected. Then he leaned down and kissed her. Not a friendly peck, not a professional gesture. A real kiss, the kind shared by people who knew each other intimately, who belonged to each other. I sat frozen in that coffee shop, watching my husband kiss another woman in broad daylight, 30 feet from his office building, where anyone could see them. The audacity was breathtaking. How long had this been going on? How many working lunches and strategy sessions had actually been dates? How many nights, when he claimed to be reviewing presentations, had he been in her apartment, in her bed? The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, it was realizing how stupid I'd been. All those signs I'd noticed, all those gut feelings I'd dismissed as paranoia, had been absolutely correct. Norman hadn't been subtle, I'd just been willfully blind, so desperate to preserve my marriage that I'd ignored obvious evidence. I watched them enter the building together, Norman's hand on the small of her back in a gesture that spoke of ownership and intimacy. They moved like a couple, like people who'd done this dance many times before. The casualness of it suggested this wasn't a new development, this was an established relationship, a secret life. Norman had been living parallel to our marriage. That evening, I waited for Norman to come home, armed with questions I'd never asked before. When he walked through the door at his usual late hour, I was sitting in our living room, still in the clothes I'd worn to spy on him, my mind cycling through everything I'd witnessed. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Busy, he said, not looking at me as he loosened his tie. The Morrison account is demanding. Natalie and I had to work through lunch to get everything organized. There it was, the lie delivered so smoothly, so practiced. How many times had he mentioned working with Natalie, while carefully omitting the true nature of their relationship? How many fabricated stories had he told me while he was building a life with someone else? Natalie, I repeated tell me about her. Norman's shoulders tensed slightly, but his voice remained casual. She's Hector Maxton's daughter, graduated from Wharton, very sharp mind for business. She's been invaluable on this project. And attractive? I asked, watching his face carefully. I suppose, he said, with forced indifference. I don't really notice those things about colleagues. The lie was so blatant, so insulting to my intelligence, that I felt something break inside me. This was the man who'd promised to honor and cherish me, who'd vowed to forsake all others, and he was standing in our living room lying to my face about the woman I'd watched him kiss hours earlier. Norman, I said quietly, I know about the affair. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Norman froze, his back still to me, and I could see the exact moment he decided how to respond. When he turned around, his face was arranged in an expression of hurt confusion. What are you talking about, Scarlett? What affair? Even caught, even confronted with direct accusation, he was going to lie. He was going to make me doubt my own eyes, my own sanity, rather than admit what I'd seen with perfect clarity. I saw you with her today, I said, my voice stronger now. Outside your building, I saw you kiss her. The mask slipped then, just for a second, and I saw panic flash across his features before he regained control. You were spying on me? Following me around like some jealous stalker? He was turning it around, making me the villain for discovering his betrayal, rather than acknowledging what he'd done. But I was beyond caring about his deflections. Just tell me the truth, Norman. For once in the past year, just tell me the truth. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, weighing his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, and the fight seemed to go out of him. It just happened, Scarlett. I didn't plan it. Natalie and we work well together. She understands the pressure I'm under, the demands of my position. It's not about you, but it was about me. It was about the choice he'd made to seek elsewhere, what he'd stopped appreciating at home. It was about the lies, the deception, the months of making me feel crazy for noticing what was right in front of me. How long? I asked. Does it matter? It matters to me. Norman ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. 6 months, maybe 7. 7 months. He'd been building a relationship with another woman for more than half a year, while coming home to me every night, sleeping in our bed, accepting my attempts at connection while giving his real attention to someone else. I sat there looking at my husband, this man I'd loved so completely, and realized I didn't recognize him anymore. The Norman I'd married would never have done this. The Norman I'd married would have talked to me, would have tried to fix our problems instead of escaping them. So what happens now? I asked. Norman looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I don't know, Scarlett. I need time to think. This is all very complicated. Complicated. My marriage, my heart, my entire life plan had become complicated, because my husband had decided to fall in love with someone else. Take all the time you need, I said, standing up from the couch. I'll be here. Apparently, I'm very good at waiting. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and closed the door, leaving Norman standing in our living room with the wreckage of our confrontation. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that the betrayal I'd just discovered would pale in comparison to what was coming. I thought the worst thing Norman could do to me was have an affair. I had no idea he was capable of so much more. The weeks following our confrontation felt like living in emotional quicksand. Every conversation was careful, measured, loaded with unspoken tensions. Norman didn't move out, but he might as well have. He became a ghost haunting our house, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Yet somehow, against all logic and self-preservation, I found myself hoping we could rebuild what we'd lost. It started with small gestures that felt like lifelines thrown to a drowning woman. 3 days after our explosive conversation, I came home to find fresh flowers on our kitchen counter, white roses, my favorites, the same ones Norman had surprised me with during our early dating years. No note, no explanation, just the flowers sitting there like a peace offering. "They're beautiful," I said, when Norman came home that evening, gesturing toward the arrangement. He glanced at them as if seeing them for the first time, though I knew he'd placed them there deliberately. "I thought you might like them." It wasn't an apology, but it felt like one. For the first time in months, Norman actually looked at me, really looked, and I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. The vulnerability in his eyes made my heart ache with possibility. 2 days later, he surprised me by coming home early with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. "I thought maybe we could eat together," he said, his voice careful, almost shy. "Like we used to." I wanted to be strong, to protect myself from further disappointment, but hope is a persistent thing. We sat at our dining room table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals and dreams, and for 2 hours it almost felt normal. Norman asked about my current design projects, listened to my stories about difficult clients, even laughed at my impression of Mrs. Henderson's particular brand of indecisiveness. "I miss this," he said quietly, as we finished eating. "I miss us." Those 3 words nearly undid me. I missed us too, desperately, painfully. I missed the easy intimacy, the shared jokes, the sense that we were a team facing the world together. I missed feeling loved by the person I loved most. "What about Natalie?" I asked, the question scraping my throat raw. Norman was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I ended it. "Yesterday. It was a mistake, Scarlett. A terrible mistake that I'll regret for the rest of my life." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. He'd chosen me. After everything, after the lies and betrayal, Norman had chosen our marriage over his affair. Maybe we could survive this. Maybe love really could conquer all. "I want to try," I whispered. "If you're serious about fixing this, I want to try." Norman reached across the table and took my hand, the first time he'd voluntarily touched me in months. His fingers were warm, familiar, and I allowed myself to believe that we were going to be okay. We agreed to see a marriage counselor, Dr. Virginia Prince, a woman with kind eyes and a reputation for helping couples rebuild after infidelity. Our first session was awkward, painful, full of careful words and buried resentments. But Norman showed up. He participated. He acknowledged his mistakes and promised to do better. "I lost sight of what was important," he told Dr. Prince, while I sat beside him, my hands clenched in my lap. "Scarlett is the best thing that ever happened to me, and I nearly threw it all away for something that meant nothing." He started coming home for dinner again. We began talking about our days, sharing small observations and minor frustrations the way we used to. Norman put his phone away during our conversations, gave me his full attention, acted like spending time with me was a privilege rather than an obligation. One evening, about 3 weeks into our reconciliation attempt, Norman suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains, the same cabin where we'd honeymooned 8 years earlier. "I want to remind us both of who we used to be," he said. "Before everything got so complicated." The weekend was magical in the way that made me forget why I'd ever doubted. We hiked familiar trails, cooked together in the tiny cabin kitchen, made love with a tenderness and passion I'd thought we'd lost forever. Norman was attentive, romantic, present in ways he hadn't been in over a year. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this up to you," he whispered, as we lay tangled together in the cabin's antique 4-poster bed. "I promise, Scarlett. I'm going to be the husband you deserve." I believed him completely. I wanted to believe him. The alternative, accepting that my marriage was over, that 8 years of love and partnership had been destroyed by 7 months of betrayal, was too devastating to contemplate. We returned from the mountains renewed, committed to rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty and communication. Norman suggested we redecorate our bedroom, removing any reminders of the difficult period we'd just survived. Together, we chose new bedding, rearranged furniture, hung new artwork. It felt symbolic, like we were literally creating a fresh start. For 6 weeks, I lived in a bubble of cautious happiness. Norman was everything I remembered him being: thoughtful, engaging, devoted. He brought me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, planned surprise date nights, left sweet notes in my design portfolio. When I had to work late on a particularly demanding project, he ordered dinner from my favorite restaurant and sat with me in my home office, reading quietly while I sketched and planned. "This is nice," I said one evening, looking up from my drafting table to find him watching me work with a soft smile. "You're beautiful when you're creating," he replied. "I forgot how much I love watching you design. You get this look of total concentration, like nothing else in the world exists." These were the moments that convinced me we'd turned a corner. Norman wasn't just going through the motions, he was genuinely engaged, genuinely present. The emotional distance that had characterized our relationship for over a year seemed to have disappeared entirely. We even started talking about children again, tentatively, carefully, but with real hope. During one of our counseling sessions, Dr. Prince asked about our future plans, and Norman reached for my hand without hesitation. "We want a family," he said simply. "We always have. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for the perfect moment and just start living." I could have cried with relief. The Norman I'd married was back, and he wanted the same things I wanted. Our shared dreams weren't dead, they'd just been temporarily derailed by a mistake he deeply regretted. But even in my happiness, I noticed small things that didn't quite fit. Norman's phone was still always face down, still accompanied him to the bathroom, and on short trips to the store. When I asked casual questions about work, his answers were detailed, but somehow felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. Sometimes I'd catch him staring into space with an expression I couldn't read, and when I'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd smile and claim it was nothing important. I told myself I was being paranoid, that trust would take time to rebuild completely. Norman was making an effort, a genuine sustained effort, and I needed to do the same. I couldn't spend our second chance looking for signs of betrayal that probably weren't even there. The night everything fell apart, we were planning our next weekend getaway. Norman had suggested we visit Napa Valley, tour wineries, stay at the same bed and breakfast, where we'd celebrated our 3rd anniversary. I was looking at their website on my laptop, excited about the prospect of another romantic escape, when Norman's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went pale. "I need to take this," he said, stepping out onto our back patio and closing the door behind him. Through the glass, I could see him talking animatedly, his free hand gesturing in ways that suggested urgency, possibly even distress. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, and when he came back inside, Norman looked shaken. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Work crisis," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm going to have to go in early tomorrow to deal with it." That night, Norman was distant again, preoccupied in ways that reminded me of the months before I'd discovered his affair. He claimed he was worried about work, but something in his demeanor felt familiar and wrong. The next morning, he left for the office before I woke up, and when I tried to call him around lunchtime, his phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself it meant nothing, that he was genuinely dealing with a work emergency, but a cold knot of dread was forming in my stomach. I had worked so hard to trust again, to believe in the man Norman claimed to be. But as I sat in our redecorated bedroom, surrounded by all the symbols of our fresh start, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been playing a beautiful, elaborate game, and the rules had just changed again. I didn't know yet that the work crisis was code, that the phone call had been Natalie telling Norman she was pregnant, or that my husband had been living a double life throughout our entire reconciliation. I thought rebuilding trust was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do. I had no idea that the real test was just beginning, and it would involve far more than just my heart. The morning that changed everything started like any other Saturday in our carefully reconstructed life. Norman had left early for what he claimed was a client emergency, the 3rd one in 2 weeks, and I decided to use the time alone to deep clean our house. It had become my way of coping with the underlying tension I couldn't quite shake, this compulsive need to control my environment when everything else felt uncertain. I started in our bedroom, stripping the bed and washing the new sheets we'd bought during our reconciliation. Then I moved to the bathroom, scrubbing tiles and organizing medicine cabinets with the kind of methodical precision that helped quiet my anxious thoughts. By noon, I'd worked my way downstairs to the kitchen, where I decided to tackle the job I'd been putting off for months, cleaning the top shelves of our pantry. Norman had always handled the high places in our house. At 6'2", he could easily reach spots that required me to drag out our stepladder. But Norman wasn't there, and I was tired of waiting for him to be available for such simple tasks. Independence had become important to me in recent weeks, even in small things. I retrieved our aluminum stepladder from the garage, the same one we'd bought when we first moved into the house 8 years ago. It had always been reliable, sturdy, though I noticed as I set it up that one of the hinges seemed slightly loose. I made a mental note to mention it to Norman, then dismissed the thought. I was only going up 3 steps to reach the top shelf. What could possibly go wrong? The pantry was deeper than I'd expected, requiring me to stretch further than felt completely comfortable to reach the dusty containers in the back. I'd already successfully cleaned 2 shelves, and was working on the third when I spotted a box of old china that had belonged to Norman's grandmother, pushed so far back I could barely see it. I should have gotten down and repositioned the ladder. Should have asked Norman to handle it when he returned. Should have listened to the small voice in my head that said this wasn't safe. Instead, I reached further, stretching my entire body to grasp the box that seemed just beyond my fingertips. The ladder shifted. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what was occurring. One moment I was reaching for the box, the next I was falling backwards through space, my arms flailing uselessly as gravity took control. The last thing I remember clearly was the terrible sound of my body hitting the hardwood floor, a sickening thud that seemed to echo through our empty house. Then nothing. I don't know how long I lay there unconscious. When awareness slowly returned, it came in fragments. The taste of blood in my mouth, the feeling of something warm and wet beneath my head, the strange angle of my legs that didn't look quite right. But the most terrifying realization was that I couldn't feel anything below my waist. Nothing. I tried to move my legs, willing them to respond, but it was as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Panic began to rise in my chest as I attempted to push myself up with my arms, only to discover that even that simple movement sent shooting pains through my spine that made me cry out. My phone was on the kitchen counter, impossibly far away. I tried calling for help, but our house was set back from the street, surrounded by mature trees that muffled sound. Our nearest neighbors were an elderly couple who spent most of their time indoors, and the Hendersons on the other side were away for the weekend. I lay there on the cold hardwood floor for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, my body growing weaker and more disoriented. The sun moved across the kitchen windows, casting different shadows as the day progressed, and still Norman didn't come home. When I finally heard his key in the front door around 6 o'clock, I wanted to weep with relief. "Norman," I called out, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Norman, I'm hurt. I'm in the kitchen." The sound of his footsteps running toward me was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. Then he was kneeling beside me, his face white with shock and what looked like genuine terror. "Jesus Christ, Scarlett, what happened? Don't move, baby, don't try to move." "I fell," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "From the ladder." "Norman, I can't feel my legs. I can't feel anything." I saw something flicker across his expression. Was it fear? Guilt? But then he was focused entirely on helping me, calling 911 while stroking my hair, and telling me everything would be okay. The paramedics arrived within minutes, professional and efficient as they assessed my condition and carefully loaded me onto a stretcher. Norman rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand and speaking in soothing tones, but I could see the worry etched deep in his features. "The stepladder," I managed to say as we raced toward the hospital. "One of the hinges was loose. I should have been more careful." Norman's grip on my hand tightened. "Don't blame yourself, sweetheart. Accidents happen. The important thing is getting you the help you need." At the hospital, everything became a blur of X-rays and CT scans, doctors speaking in hushed tones and using words I didn't want to understand. Spinal compression, potential paralysis, long-term care considerations. The phrases washed over me like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Dr. Alex Stanley, the neurologist who took charge of my case, was kind but direct. "Mrs. Bell, you've suffered a severe spinal injury. The impact compressed several vertebrae in your lower back, and there's significant swelling around the spinal cord. Will I walk again? I asked, the question scraping my throat raw. Dr. Stanley exchanged a look with Norman before answering. It's too early to make definitive predictions. We need the swelling to go down before we can fully assess the damage. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this injury could result in permanent paralysis of your lower extremities. The words hit me like physical blows. Permanent paralysis, wheelchair, never walking again, never dancing, running, climbing stairs, living the normal life I'd taken for granted just hours before. I looked at Norman, searching his face for the strength and support I desperately needed. What I saw there was complex, love and concern, yes, but something else too, something that looked almost like calculation, as if he was already working out what this meant for his life, his plans, his future. We'll get through this, he said, squeezing my hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But even as he spoke the right words, even as he made the right promises, I couldn't shake the feeling that Norman was already figuring out how to navigate this new reality, and whether I would be part of it. As they wheeled me to my hospital room that first night, my body broken and my future uncertain, I had no idea that my fall hadn't been the accident I believed it to be. I didn't know that the loose hinge on our stepladder had been deliberately loosened, or that Norman had been planning this moment for weeks. All I knew was that in the span of a few hours, everything I'd taken for granted about my life had been shattered, and the man I'd trusted to help me put the pieces back together was already planning his escape. The first week in the hospital passed in a haze of pain medication and mounting despair. Each morning I'd wake up, hoping that feeling would return to my legs, that the nightmare would end, and I'd discover this was all some terrible mistake. Instead, I was greeted by the same devastating reality, complete numbness from the waist down, a body that no longer responded to my commands, and a future that looked nothing like the life I'd planned. Norman visited every day during those first few days, arriving each morning with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, sitting beside my bed and updating me on phone calls from concerned friends and relatives. He seemed genuinely devoted, holding my hand while doctors explained treatment options and rehabilitation possibilities, asking intelligent questions about my care. But I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior that troubled me. The visits grew shorter each day, and Norman seemed increasingly distracted during them. He'd check his phone frequently, claiming it was work emergencies that couldn't wait. When I asked about specific projects he was supposedly handling, his answers were vague and defensive. "You don't need to worry about the office right now," he'd say, that familiar dismissive tone creeping back into his voice. "Focus on getting better, let me handle everything else." The phrase "getting better" felt increasingly hollow as Dr. Stanley delivered more discouraging news. The swelling in my spine wasn't reducing as quickly as they'd hoped. The initial scans showed significant damage to the neural pathways that controlled my lower body. While they wouldn't rule out the possibility of some recovery, the likelihood of regaining full mobility was becoming increasingly remote. "We need to start thinking about long-term adaptations," Dr. Stanley said gently during one of his evening rounds. "Physical therapy, occupational therapy, modifications to your home environment. The sooner we begin preparing for life in a wheelchair, the better your overall adjustment will be." Life in a wheelchair. The words still felt surreal, like they were describing someone else's reality rather than my own. I was 32 years old, had always been active and independent, and now I was being told to prepare for a completely different existence. Norman's reaction to these conversations was telling. While I struggled with the emotional weight of each new limitation Dr. Stanley described, Norman focused on practical considerations that seemed to exclude me entirely. How long would insurance cover my care? What kind of modifications would our house need? How much would all of this cost? "We need to be realistic about our options," Norman said one afternoon after Dr. Stanley had left. "Our house isn't designed for wheelchair accessibility. The stairs, the narrow doorways, the bathroom configurations, it would take massive renovations to make it workable." He wasn't wrong, but the way he discussed our home, the place where we'd built our life together, felt coldly clinical, as if he were evaluating a problematic asset rather than talking about our shared sanctuary. "We'll figure it out," I said, reaching for his hand. Whatever we need to do, we'll make it work. Norman didn't squeeze my hand back. Instead, he stared out the hospital window, his expression distant and troubled. It's not going to be that simple, Scarlett. Everything's going to change. Everything. The finality in his voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. This wasn't a man planning adaptations with his injured wife. This was someone already calculating how to extricate himself from a situation he found unacceptable. My suspicions were confirmed when Norman's visits became even more sporadic during the second week. He'd arrive late, leave early, and spend most of his time on phone calls in the hallway, rather than at my bedside. When I asked about his absences, he claimed his workload had intensified due to my medical bills and the time he'd already taken off to be with me. "I'm doing this for us," he'd say when I expressed frustration about his distance. "Someone has to keep earning money to pay for all of this." But something about his demeanor suggested his priorities had shifted in ways that didn't include supporting me through the most difficult period of my life. The man who'd once promised to stand by me through sickness and health was already backing away when faced with the reality of those vows. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I overheard a phone conversation that Norman thought I couldn't hear. He was standing in the hallway just outside my room, his voice low but still audible through the thin hospital walls. "I know this is difficult timing, but I can't keep putting my life on hold indefinitely," he was saying. "The situation has changed dramatically. We need to talk about moving forward with our plans." There was a pause then. "She's not going to recover, Natalie. The doctors are basically saying she'll be in a wheelchair permanently. I can't build a life around that. You understand, don't you?" Natalie, the name hit me like a physical blow. Despite all his promises about ending their relationship, despite our reconciliation and renewed commitment to our marriage, Norman had been in contact with his mistress throughout my entire hospitalization. While I'd been lying in bed, struggling to accept a future of disability and dependence, my husband had been planning his escape with the woman he'd supposedly given up for me. "I need more time to figure out how to handle this," Norman continued. "But yes, I still want to be with you. This doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it clearer that we belong together." I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing, not wanting Norman to know I'd overheard his betrayal. But the conversation confirmed my worst fears. He wasn't planning to support me through this crisis. He was planning to abandon me because I was no longer the woman he'd married, no longer able to provide the life he wanted. When Norman returned to my room a few minutes later, his face was arranged in an expression of concern that now looked completely false. "How are you feeling, sweetheart? You look tired." I wanted to confront him, to scream about what I'd just heard, to demand he explain how he could abandon his disabled wife for the woman who'd already destroyed our marriage once. Instead, I said nothing. I was too vulnerable, too dependent on his visits and support to risk driving him away entirely, even though I now knew he was already halfway gone. "I'm fine," I lied, watching his face carefully. "Just thinking about what comes next." "Well, don't worry about any of that right now," Norman said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "We'll cross those bridges when we come to them." Except Norman had already decided which bridges he planned to cross, and none of them led back to me. As I lay in that hospital bed, paralyzed and betrayed, I realized that my physical injuries were only the beginning of the losses I'd have to endure. The man I'd loved and trusted was preparing to leave me at the moment I needed him most, and I was powerless to stop him. Or so I thought. I had no idea that my story was far from over, and that the strength I'd discover in the coming months would prove to be more powerful than anything Norman could take from me. But first, I had to survive the complete devastation of everything I'd believed about my life and my marriage. The truth about Norman's abandonment unfolded slowly, piece by devastating piece, over the following weeks. What I initially believed was just emotional withdrawal in the face of my disability turned out to be something far more calculated and cruel. Norman hadn't just decided he couldn't handle being married to a disabled woman. He'd been systematically planning his exit strategy from the moment the doctors delivered their prognosis. It started with small practical betrayals that I almost missed in my medicated haze. Norman mentioned that he'd temporarily moved some of his belongings to a friend's place to make room for the medical equipment I'd need when I came home. When I asked which friend, his answer was vague. Just someone from work who has extra space, he said, but something about his tone suggested there was more to the story. Then there were the insurance conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. Norman spent long periods on the phone with our insurance company, and while I initially assumed he was fighting for better coverage for my treatment, fragments of overheard conversations told a different story. He was asking about coverage limits, about what would happen if we divorced, about whether my pre-existing condition would affect future policies. I need to understand my options, I heard him tell someone during one of these calls. If the marriage ends, what are my financial obligations? What's covered and what isn't? He was planning our divorce while I was still learning to transfer from a hospital bed to a wheelchair. The realization was so shocking that I questioned whether I'd heard correctly, whether the pain medication was making me paranoid. But Norman's behavior grew increasingly distant and defensive, confirming my worst suspicions. The most damning evidence came through Sheila Martinez, a nurse who'd become genuinely fond of me during my extended stay. Sheila had worked at the hospital for 15 years and had seen her share of family dynamics during medical crises. She had a gift for reading people and situations, and she'd clearly noticed things about Norman that troubled her. "Honey," she said one evening as she helped me with my physical therapy exercises, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay at home? I mean with your husband." I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" Sheila hesitated, clearly weighing whether to share what she'd observed. "It's just that I've seen a lot of spouses deal with situations like yours, and Norman, he doesn't act like someone who's planning to be a caregiver. He asks a lot of questions about discharge planning and long-term care facilities, but not the kind of questions someone asks when they're preparing to take their partner home." Her words confirmed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. Norman wasn't asking about home modifications or adaptive equipment because he wasn't planning for me to come home. He was researching alternatives, care facilities, assisted living options, anywhere he could place me that would free him from the responsibility of being my husband. "Has he asked about long-term care facilities?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Multiple times," Sheila said gently. "And he's inquired about the process for transitioning patients from acute care to permanent residential care." Permanent residential care. Norman was planning to put me in a facility and walk away from our marriage, our life, everything we'd built together. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated, that I felt physically sick. But there was more. Through a series of careless moments and overheard conversations, I began to piece together the full extent of Norman's deception. He hadn't just maintained contact with Natalie throughout my hospitalization, they'd been making concrete plans for their future together. I learned this when Virginia Prince, our former marriage counselor, called the hospital to check on my recovery. Norman had told her we were doing well, that we were working through the challenges together as a team. But Dr. Prince mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "I'm so glad Norman found the strength to commit fully to your marriage," she said, during our brief phone conversation. "When he called last week to cancel your future appointments, he seemed much more at peace with your situation. Norman had canceled our marriage counseling without telling me. While sitting beside my hospital bed and promising to support me through recovery, he'd been quietly dismantling the very resources we'd established to strengthen our relationship." The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unexpected source, Norman himself. During one of his increasingly rare visits, his phone rang and he answered it without checking the caller ID, clearly expecting it to be someone else. "Hey beautiful," he said warmly before realizing his mistake. "Oh sorry, I thought you were. This is Norman." The warmth in his voice when he said, "Hey beautiful," was unmistakable. This was how he used to greet me during our happy years. But he hadn't spoken to me that way in months. That tone of voice, that automatic intimacy, belonged to someone else now. He quickly ended the call and claimed it was a wrong number, but the damage was done. I'd heard how Norman sounded when he was talking to someone he loved, and it wasn't the careful, guilty tone he used with me anymore. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to Norman's behavior and discovered a pattern that broke my heart completely. He would arrive at the hospital tense and distracted, check his phone constantly, and leave as soon as visiting hours ended. But sometimes, as he walked down the hallway away from my room, I could hear his voice change as he made phone calls. The professional, slightly strained tone he used when talking to doctors or insurance companies would transform into something warm and intimate. He was calling Natalie the moment he left my bedside, probably giving her updates on my condition and reassuring her that his plan to leave me was still on track. One afternoon, I finally gathered the courage to confront him directly. When Norman arrived for his usual brief visit, I was ready. "I know about Natalie," I said without preamble. Norman's face went pale, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "What are you talking about? I know you never ended things with her. I know you've been making plans. I know you're looking into care facilities to dump me in so you can start your new life." For a moment, Norman looked like he might deny everything. Then his shoulders sagged and the mask slipped completely. "Scarlett, this isn't how I wanted you to find out." "Find out what, exactly?" Norman ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had once seemed endearing, but now just looked like the action of a man caught in his own web of lies. "I can't do this," he said finally. "I thought I could, but I can't. This isn't the life I signed up for. You're not the woman I married anymore." The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. I wasn't the woman he'd married, because I'd been catastrophically injured. I was still me, still intelligent, still loving, still capable of being a partner, but now I needed help with physical tasks. That was enough for Norman to discard 8 years of marriage like it was a broken appliance. "So what's your plan?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to file for divorce," Norman said, unable to meet my eyes. "I'll make sure you're taken care of, in a good facility with excellent medical support, but I can't sacrifice my entire future for this." And there it was. Norman had decided that loving me through disability was too much of a sacrifice, too much of an inconvenience for the life he wanted with Natalie. He was willing to abandon me at my most vulnerable moment because I was no longer useful to his happiness. As I lay in that hospital bed, processing the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my marriage, I had no idea that Norman's betrayal went even deeper than I'd discovered. I didn't yet know that my fall hadn't been an accident, or that the man I'd trusted with my life had actually been the one to endanger it. But even without knowing the full truth, I understood that I was facing a choice. I could let Norman's abandonment destroy me completely, or I could find a way to rebuild myself into someone stronger than I'd ever been before. The decision, when it came, was easier than I expected. If Norman wanted to abandon the woman he thought I'd become, then I would show him exactly who I really was. And he was going to regret underestimating me. 3 weeks after Norman's devastating confession about filing for divorce, I encountered Natalie Maxton for the first time. The meeting wasn't planned, at least not by me, but I suspect Norman had grown tired of keeping his two worlds separate. He'd already made his choice clear, and perhaps he felt it was time to stop pretending that his bedside vigils meant anything more than going through the motions. She walked into my hospital room on a Tuesday afternoon when Norman was supposed to be visiting alone. I was working on my physical therapy exercises with Sheila, struggling to build the upper body strength I'd need for wheelchair navigation, when I heard Norman's voice in the hallway, accompanied by a lighter, more musical tone that was unmistakably feminine. "Are you sure this is appropriate?" the woman was asking. "I don't want to make things more difficult than they already are." "She needs to meet you eventually," Norman replied, his voice carrying that tender quality I hadn't heard directed at me in months. "Besides, Scarlett is stronger than people give her credit for. She can handle this." The irony wasn't lost on me. Norman was using my strength, the very quality that had attracted him to me years ago, as justification for subjecting me to the humiliation of meeting his mistress in my hospital bed. When they entered my room, I was struck immediately by how perfectly Natalie fit the image I'd constructed in my mind. She was beautiful in an effortless way that seemed to require no maintenance, glossy brown hair that fell in natural waves, clear skin that glowed with health, a figure that spoke of regular exercise and youth. She looked like someone who'd never faced a serious challenge in her life, someone for whom everything had always come easily. More than her physical appearance, though, it was her demeanor that cut me to the core. Natalie carried herself with the confident ease of someone who'd already won. She looked at me with what I can only describe as gentle pity, the kind of expression you might wear when visiting an elderly relative in a nursing home, kind but distant, sympathetic but detached. "Scarlett," Norman said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'd like you to meet Natalie. She's been very supportive during this difficult time." Supportive, as if she were a family friend offering casseroles rather than the woman who'd been planning her future with my husband while I lay broken in a hospital bed. "Hello, Scarlett," Natalie said, her voice soft and sweet. "I've heard so much about you. Norman speaks of you often." The lie was delivered with such practiced sincerity that I almost admired her composure. This woman had been sleeping with my husband, planning to take my place in his life, and yet she could stand beside my wheelchair and speak to me as if we were meeting at a charity luncheon. "I'm sure he does," I replied, matching her tone. "Norman has always been very thorough in his communications." Natalie either missed the edge in my voice or chose to ignore it. She moved closer to my bed, her expensive perfume wafting toward me, the same scent I'd noticed on Norman's clothes months ago when I first suspected his affair. "I want you to know that I think what you're going through is incredibly brave," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension disguised as compassion. "The way you're handling this tragedy, your positive attitude despite everything, it's truly inspiring." Tragedy. She called my situation a tragedy, while standing there as the beneficiary of my husband's abandonment. The audacity was breathtaking, but what struck me most was how she spoke about my condition as if it were terminal rather than something I might overcome. "Thank you," I said carefully. "It's been educational. You learn a lot about people when you're in a vulnerable position. You discover who stands by you and who doesn't." Norman shifted uncomfortably, but Natalie seemed unfazed. If anything, my subtle barb seemed to energize her, as if she'd been waiting for me to acknowledge the reality of the situation. "Well, I think it's wonderful that you have such a positive support system here at the hospital," she said, gesturing toward Sheila, who was watching this exchange with barely concealed disgust. "Norman told me about all the excellent care you're receiving. He's been so worried about making sure you have everything you need." The way she spoke about Norman's concern for my welfare, as if she were somehow responsible for ensuring it, made my blood boil. This woman was discussing my husband's attention to my needs as if she were graciously allowing him to visit his sick pet. "Norman has been attentive," I said, watching both their faces carefully. "Though I know his work schedule has been demanding lately, all those late meetings and business dinners." Natalie's smile flickered slightly, and I saw Norman's jaw tighten. Good. Let them both remember that their affair had been built on lies and stolen time. "The consulting business is very demanding," Natalie agreed smoothly. "But Norman is so dedicated to providing security for everyone he cares about. He works incredibly hard to make sure all his responsibilities are met." All his responsibility, as if I were just another item on Norman's to-do list, something to be managed and eventually checked off. What struck me most about Natalie during this excruciating encounter was her absolute certainty that she'd won. She wasn't nervous about meeting me, wasn't concerned about my potential reaction to her presence. She moved through my hospital room like she was already mistress of Norman's life, like my opinion or feelings were irrelevant to the future she'd already claimed. "I hope you don't mind me saying," Natalie continued, her voice taking on a more intimate tone, "but Norman has shared how difficult this transition has been for both of you. Making these kinds of life decisions when everything has changed so dramatically, it takes real courage to face reality." Face reality, she was telling me in the most polite way possible, to accept that Norman was leaving me for her. She was encouraging me to be graceful about my own abandonment, to make their transition into a public relationship as smooth as possible. "You're absolutely right," I said, surprising both of them with my agreement. Reality can be very illuminating. Sometimes you discover that people aren't who you thought they were. Sometimes you realize that what seemed solid was actually built on very shaky ground. Natalie nodded sympathetically, completely missing the warning in my words. "Exactly, and I think it shows real maturity that you're being so understanding about Norman's need to to think about his future happiness. His future happiness, not our future happiness, not the future we'd planned together, but his individual pursuit of joy that apparently couldn't include a disabled wife. As I watched Natalie speak, saw the way she touched Norman's arm possessively, noticed how she positioned herself as the reasonable adult helping manage a difficult situation, I realized something important. This woman completely underestimated me. She saw a broken, abandoned woman in a hospital bed, and assumed I was defeated. She thought my disability made me powerless, that my situation made me pathetic. She had no idea that her smug certainty was going to be her downfall. She couldn't imagine that the woman she was so condescendingly pitying was already planning her comeback. And she definitely didn't know that the accident that had landed me here wasn't random at all, though I didn't fully understand that myself yet. Well, Natalie said, after a few more minutes of torture disguised as small talk, I should let you rest. Norman, are you ready to go? The casual way she managed his schedule, the assumption that he would leave when she decided it was time, showed me exactly how their relationship worked. Norman had traded a partnership for a dictatorship, and he was too infatuated to realize it. As they prepared to leave, Natalie turned back to me with one final devastating smile. Take care of yourself, Scarlett. I'm sure everything will work out for the best. For the best. For whom, I wondered. Certainly for her and Norman, but as I watched them walk away together, Norman's hand protectively on her back, I made myself a promise. Natalie Maxton had made the mistake of underestimating me, and I was going to make sure she learned exactly how costly that error would be. The night after meeting Natalie, I lay awake in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with a clarity I hadn't felt since before my accident. The encounter had stripped away any remaining illusions about my situation. Norman wasn't conflicted about leaving me, he was methodically planning his exit. Natalie wasn't a temporary distraction, she was his chosen future, and I wasn't a wife fighting for her marriage, I was an obstacle they were both waiting to overcome. But as I processed the devastating reality of my abandonment, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, I felt anger. Instead of defeat, I felt determination. Instead of accepting their narrative about my tragic circumstances, I began to see the situation differently. Yes, I was disabled. Yes, I was alone, but I was far from powerless. The transformation started with a simple realization: everyone was underestimating me. Norman saw a broken woman who would quietly accept institutionalization. Natalie saw a defeated rival who posed no threat to her happiness. Even the hospital staff, with their gentle encouragement about adjusting to my new reality, seemed to view me as someone whose life had essentially ended. They were all wrong. Sheila, I said when my favorite nurse came in for the morning medication round, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Sheila had become more than just my nurse over the past month. She was someone who'd seen me at my most vulnerable and hadn't treated me like a charity case. Her directness was exactly what I needed now. What is it, honey? She asked, checking my chart with her usual efficiency. Do you think I'm going to be stuck in a wheelchair forever? Sheila paused, considering her answer carefully. What did Dr. Stanley tell you about your prognosis? He said there was significant damage, that I should prepare for permanent paralysis, but he also said they needed more time to assess everything fully. I want to know what you think, not what the doctors are required to say for liability reasons. Sheila set down my chart and looked at me directly. I've been doing this for 15 years, Scarlett. I've seen patients with injuries like yours who never regained sensation, and I've seen others who surprised everyone. Your case, there are some things that don't quite add up. What do you mean? Your reflexes aren't completely gone. During some of your physical therapy sessions, I've noticed involuntary muscle responses that suggest your spinal cord might not be as damaged as the initial scans indicated. Sometimes swelling can create symptoms that look worse than the actual injury. My heart began to race. Are you saying I might recover? I'm saying you shouldn't give up hope. And I'm saying that if I were you, I'd be pushing for more comprehensive testing instead of accepting the initial diagnosis as final. That conversation changed everything. If there was even a possibility that I could regain some mobility, I had to pursue it. Not just for my own sake, but because walking again would completely destroy Norman and Natalie's carefully laid plans. They were counting on my permanent disability to justify their actions. What would happen to their narrative if I recovered? I asked Dr. Stanley for additional testing, but he was reluctant to authorize expensive procedures when my insurance was already strained. "Mrs. Bell," he said, during one of our sessions, "I understand your hope, but we need to be realistic about resource allocation. Your energy would be better spent on adaptation therapy." But I wasn't willing to accept his caution. I began researching my condition obsessively, using the hospital's Wi-Fi to learn everything I could about spinal injuries, recovery possibilities, and cutting-edge treatments. What I discovered was that cases like mine weren't as hopeless as I'd been led to believe, especially if the paralysis was caused by swelling rather than complete cord severance. More importantly, I learned about a specialist in the city, Dr. Hector Prince, who had developed innovative treatment protocols for spinal injuries. His success rate with cases similar to mine was significantly higher than conventional approaches, but his methods were considered experimental and weren't covered by most insurance plans. I called his office myself, explaining my situation to his assistant. Dr. Prince agreed to review my case files, and 3 days later, he called me directly. "Mrs. Bell," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd seen miraculous recoveries, "I've reviewed your scans and medical reports. I believe there's a very good chance that what everyone is calling permanent paralysis is actually an extreme compression response. With the right treatment protocol, you could potentially regain significant mobility." "What kind of treatment?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Intensive physical therapy combined with some newer techniques I've developed. It would require several months of daily sessions, complete dedication to the program, and honestly, it would be the hardest thing you've ever done. But I've seen patients with your exact injury profile walk out of my clinic." The catch, of course, was that his treatment program cost nearly $50,000 and would have to be paid entirely out of pocket. Norman controlled our finances, and he was already planning to divorce me. There was no way he would agree to fund an expensive treatment that might interfere with his plans to institutionalize me. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I had options Norman didn't know about. Before my accident, I'd built a successful interior design business. I had clients who owed me money, projects that were nearly complete, and most importantly, I had a savings account that Norman had forgotten about, one I'd opened years ago with my maiden name, originally intended for a surprise anniversary trip that had never happened. That night, I began making phone calls. I contacted my business clients, explaining my situation, and asking for immediate payment of outstanding invoices. I reached out to former colleagues who'd been offering help since my accident, asking them to take over my pending projects in exchange for the fees I was owed. Within a week, I'd managed to scrape together enough money to begin Dr. Prince's program. The next step was figuring out how to undergo intensive physical therapy without Norman's knowledge. He was visiting less frequently now, sometimes going days without stopping by the hospital. When I asked the staff about discharge planning, I learned that Norman had indeed been inquiring about long-term care facilities. He was planning to have me transferred directly from the hospital to a rehabilitation center that was really just a permanent care facility. But Norman's abandonment, which was meant to isolate me, actually created the perfect opportunity for my secret recovery. If he wasn't paying attention to my daily routine, he wouldn't notice when I started leaving the hospital for treatment sessions. I enlisted Sheila's help explaining my plan and asking her to cover for my absences. She was initially hesitant, helping a patient deceive their family could cost her job, but when I showed her Dr. Prince's treatment plan and explained Norman's real intentions, she became my fiercest ally. "That son of a bitch," she said, after I told her about Norman's plan to institutionalize me. "He's not going to get away with this, honey. I'll help you however I can." Within 2 weeks, I had everything arranged. Dr. Prince would send a medical transport to collect me for daily therapy sessions. Sheila would ensure my absences weren't noted in my official records, and I would use every ounce of determination I possessed to regain my ability to walk. Norman thought he was discarding a broken woman who would quietly disappear into institutional care. Natalie thought she was inheriting a man who'd made a difficult but necessary choice about his future. Neither of them imagined that I was planning the most dramatic comeback of my life. As I prepared for my first session with Dr. Prince, I thought about the moment when I would walk back into their lives. They wanted to write me off as yesterday's tragedy. Fine. I would show them exactly what yesterday's tragedy was capable of achieving. The war was just beginning, and they had no idea I was already winning. My first session with Dr. Hector Prince was both the most hopeful and most terrifying experience I'd had since my accident. His clinic was nothing like the sterile, institutional feel of the hospital. Instead, it resembled a high-end fitness facility combined with a medical research center, state-of-the-art equipment, motivational success stories covering the walls, and an energy that spoke of miracles happening daily. Dr. Prince himself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45. With the kind of confident demeanor that comes from achieving the impossible on a regular basis. When he examined me, his touch was clinical, but somehow reassuring, and his questions were more detailed than any doctor had asked before. "Tell me about the moment of your fall," he said, his hands checking my reflexes with instruments I'd never seen before. "Walk me through exactly what happened, how you landed, what you felt immediately afterward." As I described the accident, Dr. Prince nodded thoughtfully, occasionally asking for clarification about angles, impact points, and the timeline of when sensation disappeared. His thoroughness suggested he was seeing something others had missed. "Mrs. Bell," he said, after completing his examination, "I'm going to be completely honest with you. Your case is unusual. The pattern of your paralysis, the specific areas affected, the way your body responded to the initial trauma, it's all consistent with what we call compression paralysis, rather than traumatic severance." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means your spinal cord wasn't cut or permanently damaged. Instead, the fall created severe swelling and pressure that's essentially turned off the neural pathways to your lower body. Think of it like a garden hose that's been kinked. The water can't flow through, but the hose itself isn't broken." Hope flooded through me so intensely that I felt dizzy. "So I can recover. With the right treatment, intensive therapy, and frankly more determination than most people possess. Yes, I believe you can regain significant mobility, but I need you to understand what you're committing to." Dr. Prince outlined a program that would make military boot camp look like a spa retreat. 6 days a week, 4 hours a day for at least 4 months. The therapy would combine traditional physical rehabilitation with cutting-edge techniques, including electrical stimulation, specialized exercises, and what he called neural retraining sessions. "It will be the most difficult thing you've ever done," he warned. "There will be days when you want to quit, when the pain makes you question whether it's worth it. But if you're willing to fight for it, I believe we can get you walking again." I signed up immediately. The logistics of maintaining my secret therapy sessions, while Norman remained oblivious, required careful planning. Sheila helped me establish a cover story about additional testing that would explain my regular absences from the hospital. Dr. Prince's clinic provided medical transport that looked official enough to fool casual observers, and I scheduled my sessions during the hours when Norman was least likely to visit. But therapy was only part of my strategy. If I was going to reclaim my life, I needed to understand exactly what Norman and Natalie were planning, and I needed evidence of their deception that I could use when the time came. This is where my background in interior design became unexpectedly valuable. My profession had taught me to observe details others missed, to understand how people really lived versus how they wanted to appear. Now I applied those skills to studying my husband and his mistress. I began paying closer attention to Norman's behavior during his visits, noting inconsistencies in his stories about work and travel. When he mentioned business trips, I made note of the dates and details. When he claimed to be working late on specific projects, I remembered the client names and timelines. Norman thought I was too medicated and depressed to notice these details, but I was actually building a comprehensive record of his lies. More importantly, I started reaching out to our mutual friends and acquaintances, carefully probing for information about Norman's activities. I discovered that Virginia Prince, our former marriage counselor, was deeply concerned about Norman's decision to cancel therapy without my knowledge. She mentioned that she'd received calls from others in our social circle who were confused about Norman's behavior during my hospitalization. People are talking, Scarlett, Virginia told me during one of our phone conversations. Norman's been seen around town with a young woman, and it's making people uncomfortable. The way he's handling your situation, it's not sitting well with anyone who knows you both. This information was gold. Norman and Natalie thought they were being discreet, but their relationship was already causing gossip in our social circles. More importantly, people were sympathetic to me and critical of Norman's behavior. When I eventually revealed the truth about their affair and Norman's abandonment, I wouldn't be fighting alone. I also began documenting everything related to my medical care and Norman's involvement in my treatment decisions. I saved every text message, every email, every voicemail where Norman discussed insurance limitations or suggested that expensive treatments weren't worth pursuing. I kept records of his inquiries about long-term care facilities, his questions about the legal process for making medical decisions for an incapacitated spouse. The picture that emerged was damning. Norman wasn't just planning to leave me, he was actively undermining my recovery to justify his abandonment. But perhaps the most important part of my preparation was psychological. Every day in Dr. Prince's clinic, as I pushed my body through exercises that left me exhausted and sometimes in tears, I visualized the moment when I would walk back into Norman and Natalie's lives. I imagined their shock, their fear, their desperate attempts to explain away their behavior. "What's driving you?" Dr. Prince asked one afternoon when I'd pushed through a particularly brutal session without complaint. "I've seen a lot of patients fight for recovery, but your determination is extraordinary. What's waiting for you on the other side of this?" "Justice," I said simply. He nodded, as if that explained everything. "Good. Justice is a powerful motivator. Just make sure you don't lose yourself in the pursuit of it." His warning was wise, but I was beyond caring about taking the high road. Norman and Natalie had made a calculation that I was too broken to fight back, too dependent to threaten their happiness. They'd underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and most critically, my capacity for righteous anger. As I progressed through my therapy sessions, growing stronger each day while Norman and Natalie planned their future together, I realized I was fighting for something bigger than just my ability to walk. I was fighting for the principle that people shouldn't be able to destroy others without consequences. I was fighting for every abandoned spouse who'd been told to be understanding about their partner's need for happiness. But most of all, I was fighting to prove that they'd picked the wrong woman to betray. Norman thought he knew me, thought he understood my limits and capabilities. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about the woman he'd married. The foundation of my comeback was almost complete. Soon it would be time to start building the structure of my revenge. 6 weeks into my secret therapy sessions, I felt the first miraculous tingle in my left foot. It happened during what Dr. Prince called a neural stimulation session, where electrodes sent carefully calibrated pulses through my lower spine. The sensation was so unexpected, so overwhelming, that I started crying right there on the treatment table. "Did you feel that, Dr. Prince asked, his voice carefully controlled, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "Yes," I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might make the sensation disappear. I felt it. That tiny flutter of feeling in my toe was more than just medical progress. It was the first crack in Norman and Natalie's foundation of certainty. They'd built their entire plan around my permanent disability, around the narrative that I was a tragic figure who needed to be managed rather than a woman who could reclaim her power. But I wasn't ready to reveal my progress yet. Instead, I used my growing strength to begin the more delicate phase of my strategy, gathering evidence and setting the stage for their downfall. My first move was deceptively simple. During one of Norman's increasingly brief hospital visits, I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about our financial situation. "I know this has been expensive," I said, arranging my features in an expression of resigned acceptance. "The medical bills, the time you've had to take off work. I don't want to be a burden on your future." Norman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Scarlett, you don't need to worry about that right now, but I do worry," I continued, watching his face carefully. "I've been thinking that maybe you should start protecting your assets. You know, in case something happens to me, or if the medical expenses get out of control. Maybe we should look into separating our finances temporarily. The relief that flashed across Norman's features was so obvious it was almost comical. Here I was, his supposedly broken wife, offering to make his abandonment easier by voluntarily removing myself from his financial life. That's very thoughtful of you, Norman said, trying to hide his eagerness. If you're sure that's what you want, I could speak to our lawyer about setting up some temporary arrangements. I think that would be wise, I said softly. I just want what's best for both of us. Norman left that day practically skipping down the hospital corridor, no doubt calling Natalie immediately to share the good news that his inconvenient wife was cooperating in her own financial abandonment. But what Norman didn't realize was that I'd just manipulated him into taking actions that would ultimately work against him. By pushing for financial separation while I was still legally disabled and dependent on his support, he was creating a clear legal record of abandoning his responsibilities to his injured spouse. Every step he took to protect himself would eventually become evidence of his cruelty. My second move involved reaching out to Kirby Anderson, a private investigator who'd been recommended by Virginia Prince. Kirby specialized in matrimonial cases and had a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. Mrs. Bell, Kirby said during our initial phone consultation, I need to ask you directly, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish? Are you looking to save your marriage or end it? I'm looking for truth, I said. And justice. My husband is planning to abandon me while I'm disabled, and I want to make sure that when he does, everyone knows exactly who he really is. Kirby agreed to document Norman and Natalie's relationship, their financial arrangements, and most importantly, any evidence that Norman was undermining my medical care for his own benefit. Within 2 weeks, Kirby had provided me with a comprehensive dossier that was even more damning than I'd expected. The photos showed Norman and Natalie acting like a couple in public, holding hands at restaurants, kissing in parking lots, shopping together for what appeared to be household items. But it was the financial information that truly shocked me. Norman had already opened a joint bank account with Natalie, and had been transferring money from our shared accounts into investments that only had his name on them. More disturbing, Kirby had discovered that Norman had been telling people that I was unlikely to recover, and that he was preparing for a long period of caregiving responsibility. He was simultaneously planning to abandon me while positioning himself as a devoted husband, making a difficult sacrifice. The most valuable information came from recordings Kirby had made of Norman's phone conversations. In one particularly revealing call with Natalie, Norman discussed his timeline for filing divorce papers. I need to wait until she's transferred to the care facility, Norman said. If I file while she's still in the hospital, it looks too cruel. But once she's settled somewhere permanent, I can claim that I tried to make it work, but the situation was too much to handle. In another conversation, Norman discussed his strategy for minimizing alimony payments. If she's permanently disabled and requiring institutional care, I can argue that her living expenses are already covered by the facility. The court won't expect me to maintain her in a lifestyle she can't even enjoy anymore. Listening to these recordings was devastating, but they also provided exactly the ammunition I needed. Norman thought he was being strategic, but he was actually documenting his own cruelty for posterity. My third move was the most psychologically satisfying. I began reaching out to our mutual friends and acquaintances, not to gossip or complain, but to ensure that my version of events would be heard before Norman could start controlling the narrative. I called Eleanor Hendricks, the president of our country club's women's auxiliary, and one of the most influential women in our social circle. Eleanor had always liked me, and when I explained my situation, carefully, without seeming bitter, she was horrified. Scarlett, I had no idea Norman was handling things this way, Eleanor said. Some of us had noticed him around town with that young woman, but we assumed it was work-related. Are you telling me he's planning to divorce you while you're still recovering? I don't want to speak badly of Norman, I said, practicing the gracious dignity I planned to maintain throughout this entire ordeal. I'm sure this is incredibly difficult for him too. I just wanted you to know the truth before things become more public. Eleanor assured me that I would have the support of our entire social circle, and I knew she would share this information with others. By the time Norman made his abandonment official, everyone who mattered in our community would already understand exactly what kind of man he was. But perhaps my most important move was one that Norman and Natalie would never see coming. Using my maiden name and the business contacts I'd maintained throughout my marriage, I quietly began rebuilding my professional network. I reached out to former clients, interior design colleagues, and industry contacts, explaining that I was planning to return to work once my recovery allowed. The response was overwhelming. Not only did people express support and sympathy for my situation, but several offered immediate freelance projects that I could work on remotely. Within a month, I had quietly re-established my design business and was generating income that Norman knew nothing about. Every day, as sensation slowly returned to more of my lower body, and I grew stronger in my secret therapy sessions, I felt more confident about the reckoning that was coming. Norman and Natalie thought they were in control of this situation, but they were actually dancing to music I was composing. The most beautiful part was that they had no idea what was coming. Norman continued his perfunctory hospital visits, discussing discharge plans and long-term care options with the casual cruelty of someone disposing of an inconvenient responsibility. Natalie continued her occasional appearances, radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who'd successfully stolen another woman's life. Neither of them noticed that I was getting stronger, more focused, more dangerous with each passing day. They were so convinced of my helplessness that they couldn't see I was preparing to destroy everything they'd built on the ruins of my life. The best revenge, I was learning, wasn't just about getting even. It was about being so thoroughly underestimated that your enemies helped you plan their own downfall. 3 months into my secret rehabilitation, I achieved what Dr. Prince called a breakthrough moment. I was able to stand, unassisted, for 30 seconds. The feeling of supporting my own weight after months of wheelchair dependency was indescribable, a rush of power and possibility that made me understand I was no longer the victim. "Scarlett, this is remarkable progress," Dr. Prince said as I gripped the parallel bars, my legs trembling but holding. "At this rate, you could be walking independently within 6 weeks." 6 weeks. That timeline gave me the perfect framework for the final phase of my plan. But first, I had an important revelation to share with someone who deserved to know the truth about my progress. Dr. Alex Stanley, my original neurologist. I'd grown to respect him during my hospital stay, and I realized his conservative prognosis had been based on limited information and standard protocols rather than malicious intent. "Dr. Stanley," I said, when I called his office, "I need to schedule an appointment to discuss my case. There have been some developments you should know about." When I arrived at his office a week later, I could see the surprise in his eyes as I transferred from the wheelchair to his examination chair, with significantly more strength and control than I'd possessed months earlier. "Mrs. Bell, you seem to be moving much better," he observed, beginning his examination. "Have you been doing additional therapy?" "I have," I admitted. "And there's something important I need to tell you. I've been working with Dr. Hector Prince, and we've discovered that my paralysis isn't permanent. It's compression-related, and I'm recovering sensation and mobility." Dr. Stanley's examination confirmed what I already knew. The reflexes that had been absent months ago were returning. The muscle tone in my legs was improving. Most importantly, I could feel his touch along areas that had been completely numb since my accident. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Stanley said, his professional composure barely containing his excitement. "Mrs. Bell, this changes everything about your prognosis. With continued therapy, you could potentially make a full recovery." "That's what I'm hoping for," I said. "But I need to ask you for a favor. I need you to keep this information confidential for now. There are personal reasons why I'm not ready to share this news with my husband yet." Dr. Stanley looked puzzled, but agreed to maintain confidentiality. What he didn't understand was that my medical breakthrough was just one element of a much larger strategy that was finally coming together. The same week I revealed my progress to Dr. Stanley. Kirby Anderson delivered the most damaging evidence yet against Norman and Natalie. Through careful surveillance and financial investigation, he'd uncovered something that made their betrayal even more calculated than I'd imagined. "Scarlett, you need to see this," Kirby said when he called with an urgent update. I've discovered that Norman and Natalie have been planning your accident. My blood ran cold. What do you mean, planning it? I found records showing that Norman purchased a new stepladder 3 days before your fall. But here's the thing. He returned the old ladder to the store the day after your accident, claiming it was defective. I managed to track down the returned ladder, and guess what? Someone had deliberately weakened the hinges. The room seemed to spin around me as the implications sank in. My fall hadn't been an accident at all. Norman had sabotaged our ladder, knowing I would eventually use it to clean the house while he was conveniently away. He'd tried to seriously injure me, possibly even kill me, to clear the path for his new life with Natalie. There's more, Kirby continued. I have phone records showing that Norman called Natalie immediately after he found you on the kitchen floor. But here's the interesting part. That call lasted 12 minutes. Who talks for 12 minutes when their wife is unconscious and bleeding? Unless they're coordinating their story. The evidence was overwhelming. Norman hadn't just abandoned me after my accident, he'd caused it. This wasn't just adultery and abandonment, this was attempted murder. But instead of going immediately to the police, I made a strategic decision. This information was too valuable to waste on criminal charges that might take years to resolve. Instead, I would use it as the centerpiece of my ultimate confrontation with Norman and Natalie. I spent the following weeks carefully planning that confrontation while continuing to play the role of the defeated, disabled wife. Norman's visits had dwindled to once a week, and during these brief encounters, he grew increasingly impatient to finalize the transition plan for my long-term care. "Scarlett, we need to make some decisions," Norman said during one of his final hospital visits. "I've found an excellent facility about an hour outside the city. It's specifically designed for people with spinal injuries, and they have amazing programs for helping patients adjust to their new reality." "That sounds wonderful," I said, maintaining the defeated tone I'd perfected. "I trust your judgment completely. When would I be moving there?" "Well, if you're ready, we could arrange the transfer next month. The sooner you can start adapting to your permanent situation, the better it will be for everyone." Permanent situation. Even now, knowing I was recovering, Norman was still pushing the narrative of my hopeless condition. But I noticed something else in his demeanor: relief. He thought the finish line was in sight, that his problematic wife would soon be safely tucked away, where she couldn't interfere with his happiness. "Actually, Norman," I said, "I've been thinking about having a small gathering before I transfer to the facility. Nothing elaborate, just our closest friends and family. A chance to say goodbye to the life we had together." Norman looked uncomfortable with the idea, but he couldn't object without seeming heartless. "If that's what you want, Scarlett, whatever would make this transition easier for you." "Thank you," I said sweetly. "I think it would mean a lot to everyone to have closure. Maybe we could have it at the country club. Our anniversary is coming up next month. It seems fitting to mark the end of our marriage the same way we celebrated its beginning." What Norman didn't realize was that I wasn't planning a goodbye party. I was planning the most dramatic revelation of his lifetime, the moment when everyone he'd lied to would learn the truth about who he really was. As I watched him leave the hospital that day, probably calling Natalie to celebrate another step toward his freedom, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since this nightmare began. Norman thought he was managing the final details of disposing of his inconvenient wife. Instead, he was planning his own public destruction. In 6 weeks, when I walked into that anniversary gathering under my own power, Norman and Natalie would discover that they'd underestimated more than just my physical resilience. They'd underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and most fatally, my capacity for patient, methodical revenge. The woman Norman had tried to kill was about to rise from the ashes, and she was bringing evidence that would destroy him completely. As the date of my planned anniversary gathering approached, Norman and Natalie's behavior shifted in ways that revealed just how much they had to lose. What had started as casual arrogance evolved into something more desperate and dangerous. They could sense, perhaps unconsciously, that their carefully constructed plan was somehow unraveling. It began with Norman's sudden interest in accelerating my transfer to the long-term care facility. Where he'd previously been content to wait until after our anniversary gathering, he now seemed urgently focused on having me moved as quickly as possible. "Scarlett, I've been reconsidering the timeline," he said during what would be one of his last hospital visits. "The facility has an opening available immediately. I think we should take it rather than waiting until after your party." "But all the arrangements are already made," I protested, maintaining my helpless persona while internally celebrating his obvious panic. "People are expecting to say goodbye. It would be rude to cancel now." Norman's jaw tightened with frustration. "I just think it would be better for you to get settled into your new routine as soon as possible. The doctors agree that prolonging the transition isn't healthy." This was a lie, of course. I'd spoken to Dr. Stanley, and he'd expressed no such opinion. But Norman was clearly feeling pressure from somewhere, though I couldn't yet identify the source. The source became clear when Kirby Anderson called with an urgent update about his surveillance of Norman and Natalie. "Scarlett, they're getting nervous about something," Kirby reported. "I've been monitoring their communications, and there's been a significant increase in activity over the past week. Natalie has been pushing Norman to finalize everything before your anniversary gathering. She seems worried that you're planning something." "What could possibly make her think that?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Well, it turns out Natalie has been doing some investigating of her own. She hired someone to look into your recent activities, and they may have discovered your therapy sessions with Dr. Prince." My blood ran cold. If they knew about my recovery, everything I'd planned could be compromised. "How much do they know?" "I'm not sure, but from what I've overheard, they know you've been leaving the hospital regularly and that you've been paying for something medical-related. They don't seem to understand the full extent of your progress, but they're definitely suspicious." This development forced me to accelerate my own timeline. If Norman and Natalie were becoming desperate, they might take actions that could derail my carefully orchestrated revenge. I needed to move quickly. The first sign of their escalating desperation came in the form of a visit from Natalie, alone. She arrived at the hospital on a Thursday afternoon, carrying flowers and wearing an expression of concerned compassion that didn't reach her eyes. "Scarlett, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed with practiced ease. "Norman mentioned that you've been having a difficult time lately, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was the woman who'd been planning to take my husband and had possibly conspired in my attempted murder, offering to help me through my difficulties. "That's very kind of you," I said carefully. "I'm just trying to adjust to my new reality." "Of course," Natalie replied, but I caught the way her eyes scanned my legs, looking for signs of movement or improvement. "Norman has told me how challenging this transition has been for both of you. It takes real strength to accept when life changes so dramatically." She was fishing for information, trying to assess whether I suspected anything about their plans or my own recovery potential. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted to hear. "Some days are harder than others," I said, letting my voice crack with manufactured vulnerability. "I know this is difficult for Norman too. He's been so devoted, but I can see the strain this is putting on him. Sometimes I wonder if he'd be better off without having to worry about me." The relief that flashed across Natalie's face was unmistakable. "Oh, Scarlett, you mustn't think like that. Norman loves you very much. He's trying to figure out how to build a future that works for everyone. A future that works for everyone. Such a delicate way to describe abandoning your disabled wife for your mistress." "I've been thinking about that too," I continued, watching her reaction carefully. "Maybe the anniversary gathering isn't such a good idea. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just quietly transferred to the care facility without all the drama of a big goodbye." "Well," Natalie said, leaning forward with poorly concealed eagerness, "if that's what you think would be best, Norman has mentioned that the facility has immediate availability. You could be settled there by the weekend, if you wanted to avoid the stress of a public farewell." There it was. Confirmation that they were actively trying to prevent the gathering I'd planned. They were afraid of something, though they couldn't articulate what, but their fear made them careless. Over the next few days, both Norman and Natalie made mistakes that provided me with even more damaging evidence. Norman began pressuring hospital staff to discharge me immediately, claiming that my mental state was deteriorating and that I needed specialized care. When the staff questioned his urgency, he became defensive and demanding in ways that made several nurses uncomfortable. More critically, Natalie started reaching out to some of our mutual acquaintances, apparently trying to control the narrative about Norman's situation before my anniversary gathering could take place. She called me yesterday, Eleanor Hendricks told me during one of our phone conversations. She wanted to explain Norman's difficult position and how hard this has been on him. She seemed very concerned about making sure people understood that he's been incredibly devoted despite the challenges. Eleanor's tone made it clear that Natalie's preemptive damage control had backfired spectacularly. "Scarlett, I have to tell you, the woman came across as manipulative and calculating. She was trying to paint Norman as some kind of saint for not abandoning you immediately, while simultaneously preparing us for the news that he was planning to do exactly that. This intelligence about their growing desperation gave me the final piece I needed for my ultimate confrontation. Norman and Natalie weren't just guilty of betrayal and attempted murder, they were now actively trying to manipulate our entire social circle to justify their actions. But their panic also made them dangerous. Desperate people make desperate choices, and I couldn't predict what they might do if they felt completely cornered. That night, I made a decision that would prove to be crucial. I called Kirby Anderson and asked him to arrange for additional security around my hospital room and to begin documenting every interaction Norman and Natalie had with anyone connected to me. "I think they're getting ready to do something drastic," I told him. "If they suspect I'm recovering, they might try to ensure that I don't make it to the anniversary gathering." "Are you saying you think they might try to hurt you again?" "I'm saying that people who've already tried to kill someone once might not hesitate to finish the job if they feel threatened." Kirby agreed to increase surveillance, and within 24 hours, he'd uncovered evidence that my instincts were correct. Norman had been researching ways to have me declared mentally incompetent, which would give him legal authority over my medical decisions. If he could convince doctors that I was having a psychological breakdown, he could have me committed to a psychiatric facility, rather than the care facility we'd discussed. But perhaps more alarmingly, Natalie had been researching my therapy sessions with Dr. Prince, and had discovered the extent of my recovery. She knew I was regaining mobility, which meant she understood that everything they'd planned was about to collapse. The final phase of this war was beginning, and my enemies were no longer content to wait for my quiet disappearance. They were preparing for a direct assault on my credibility, my sanity, and possibly my life. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated how thoroughly I'd prepared for this moment. While they'd been planning my destruction, I'd been building an empire of evidence that would not only protect me, but would ensure their complete and public annihilation. The anniversary gathering was still 5 days away, but the real battle was about to begin. The night before my anniversary gathering, I received a call that changed everything. Dr. Prince phoned me personally, his voice carrying an urgency I'd never heard before. "Scarlett, there's something you need to know immediately," he said. "I've been reviewing your original medical files more carefully, and I've discovered something disturbing. The injury pattern from your fall doesn't match what I'd expect from a typical ladder accident." My heart began racing. "What do you mean?" "The angle of impact, the specific vertebrae affected, the way the damage occurred, it's all consistent with someone who was pushed or deliberately caused to fall backward. This wasn't an accident, Scarlett. Someone intentionally injured you." Even though Kirby had already uncovered evidence of Norman's sabotage, hearing medical confirmation of the attempt on my life sent a chill through me. "Dr. Prince, I need to tell you something. I already know it wasn't an accident. My private investigator discovered that my husband sabotaged our ladder." "Then you understand what this means," Dr. Prince said grimly. "Someone tried to paralyze you, possibly kill you, and based on what I've observed during your recovery, they had detailed knowledge of spinal injuries. This wasn't random violence, this was calculated attempted murder." That revelation gave me the final piece of evidence I needed for tomorrow's confrontation. But Dr. Prince had more to tell me. "There's something else, Scarlett. Earlier today, a woman called my office claiming to be your sister. She wanted detailed information about your prognosis and recovery timeline. When we refused to give her information, she became quite aggressive. I believe someone is still actively monitoring your condition, Natalie. She was so desperate to understand the extent of my recovery that she was impersonating family members to get medical information. This confirmed my suspicions that they knew I was regaining mobility and were planning something desperate. Dr. Prince, I need to ask you one final favor, I said. Tomorrow I'm going to reveal everything to the people who matter most in my life. I need you to be there with medical documentation of both the attempted murder and my recovery. Can you do that? Absolutely, he replied, without hesitation. What they did to you, it needs to be exposed. That night, I made final preparations for what would be the most important performance of my life. I practiced walking without assistance until I could move confidently across a room. I organized all of Kirby's evidence into a comprehensive presentation. Most importantly, I called each person who would be attending tomorrow's gathering to confirm they would be there. Eleanor, I hope you'll still be able to make it tomorrow, I said, during one of these calls. I have some important news to share with everyone. Of course, dear, Eleanor replied. Are you certain you're ready for such a large gathering? Norman mentioned you've been having some difficulties lately. Actually, I've never been better, I said, allowing a hint of my true strength to show through. Tomorrow everyone will understand exactly how well I'm doing. The morning of the gathering, Sheila helped me get ready in a way that felt like preparing for battle. I chose to wear a dress I'd loved before my accident. Elegant, confident, the kind of outfit that spoke of a woman in control of her life. You look beautiful, honey, Sheila said as she watched me stand at the mirror, supporting myself without assistance. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for months, I replied. Today justice finally gets served. As I prepared to leave the hospital for what I knew would be the last time, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago I'd been a trusting wife who believed in her marriage. Today I was a woman who had literally risen from the ashes of her husband's betrayal, armed with evidence that would destroy him completely. Norman thought he was attending a farewell gathering for his disabled wife. Instead, he was walking into the complete exposure of his crimes. He and Natalie had underestimated me from the beginning, and today they would pay the ultimate price for that miscalculation. The woman they'd tried to kill was about to make her final move, and it would be checkmate. The Maplewood Heights Country Club had never looked more beautiful than it did that evening, with soft lighting illuminating the same ballroom where Norman and I had celebrated our wedding 8 years earlier. As guests arrived for what they believed was my farewell gathering, I waited in a private room adjacent to the main hall, watching through a crack in the door as my carefully orchestrated finale began. Norman and Natalie entered together, and I could see the tension in both their faces. They knew something was wrong but couldn't identify the threat. Natalie wore a black dress that seemed more appropriate for a funeral than a farewell party, while Norman kept checking his phone and scanning the room as if expecting trouble. Eleanor Hendricks had arranged the evening exactly as I'd requested. Our closest friends, Norman's colleagues from Maxton and Associates, my former clients, even Virginia Prince were all present. What Norman didn't know was that I'd asked Eleanor to ensure that several people with legal and medical backgrounds were in attendance, witnesses who could verify what they were about to see. At exactly 8 o'clock I made my entrance. I walked through the ballroom doors unassisted, my steps confident and strong, wearing the same style of dress I'd worn to our engagement party years earlier. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Gasps echoed from every corner as people processed what they were seeing. The woman they'd been told was permanently paralyzed was walking toward them under her own power. But it was Norman's face that made every moment of pain and struggle worthwhile. The color drained from his features as he stared at me in complete shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Beside him, Natalie looked like she'd seen a ghost, her hand instinctively reaching for Norman's arm as if to steady herself. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Thank you all for coming to what I told you was my farewell gathering. But as you can see, I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor stepped forward with a microphone she'd prepared, and I took it with a gracious smile. "I know you're all wondering how this is possible," I continued, addressing the crowd while watching Norman's increasingly panicked expression. 6 months ago, I fell from a ladder in my kitchen and was told I might never walk again. What I discovered during my recovery is that my fall wasn't an accident at all. Murmurs of confusion and concern rippled through the crowd. Norman tried to step forward, but I held up my hand. Before anyone says anything, I think you should all know the truth about what really happened to me, and about the man I've been married to for 8 years. I gestured to Dr. Prince and Kirby Anderson, who entered the room carrying the evidence that would end Norman's life as he knew it. Dr. Prince approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Hector Prince, and I've been treating Scarlett for the past 4 months. Her injury was never permanent. It was compression-related paralysis caused by a deliberately sabotaged ladder. Someone tried to murder her." The gasps were audible now, and I watched as people began looking between Norman and me with growing understanding. Kirby stepped forward next, holding up photographs and documents. "I'm a private investigator, and I have evidence showing that Norman Bell purchased a new ladder 3 days before his wife's fall, then returned the sabotaged ladder to the store the day after her accident, claiming it was defective." Norman finally found his voice. "This is insane. Scarlett, what are you doing? These people are lying, but I was just getting started." "Norman, would you like to explain to everyone why you called Natalie immediately after finding me unconscious, or why that call lasted 12 minutes? Or perhaps you'd like to tell them about the joint bank account you opened with her while I was in the hospital?" I could see Norman's world crumbling in real time. Several people in the crowd were already reaching for their phones, no doubt calling authorities, or beginning to distance themselves from what they now understood was a would-be murderer. "The truth is," I continued, my voice strong and clear, "Norman tried to kill me to clear the path for his affair with Natalie Maxton. When that failed, and I survived, he planned to abandon me in a care facility, while telling everyone he was making a difficult sacrifice. But I've spent the last 6 months recovering, not just physically, but gathering evidence of everything he's done. Natalie made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. This is all lies. Norman would never what?" I interrupted, pulling out my phone and playing one of Kirby's recorded conversations. Norman's voice filled the room, discussing his timeline for divorce and his strategy for minimizing alimony payments. The final nail in their coffin came when I revealed that both Dr. Stanley and Dr. Prince had confirmed that my injury pattern was consistent with deliberate harm, rather than accidental falling. As security arrived to escort Norman away, Eleanor had arranged for them to be on standby. I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before my marriage began falling apart. "The woman you tried to kill," I told Norman as he was led away, "is the woman who's going to ensure you face justice for what you've done." 6 months later, Norman was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Natalie faced charges as an accessory. Our divorce was finalized with me receiving everything we'd built together. As I stood in the garden of the home I'd redesigned, the same home where Norman had tried to end my life, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Some stories end with people living happily ever after. Mine ends with me living authentically, powerfully, and completely on my own terms. And that, I've discovered, is the best kind of victory there is. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.